Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Math for All. I'm Heidi Subnani.
And I'm Molly Vokey. We're super excited about our show today, so disregard our backgrounds because we're both on location right now. Please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and our YouTube channel, Math for All. We would love for you to like our stuff and forward it along to anyone who might be able to benefit from some of our amazing guests.
Yes, and we are so excited today. We're going to be talking about how do we make math talk, or how do we make talk in the math class more student-centered, and we're really excited about that. And we're going to be talking about that with Kassia, Wedekind. And if you don't have, these two came with me in my suitcase. If you don't have these in your bookcase and are using them, then we recommend that you do math exchanges and hands down speak out. So I'm going to read her bio and then we will invite her in. Kassia has spent many wonderful years as a classroom teacher and math coach in Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia, and now splits her time between being an independent math coach and an editor at Stenhouse Publishers. Her favorite days are spent in classrooms learning from the many ways children talk, listen, and negotiate meaning together. So we are so excited to have her here with us.
Hello.
Hi, Kassia.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled, and we are super excited about your topic. We have had a lot of talk this season about kind of making classrooms more wonderful
Friendly,
places. More friendly for students. And I think your topic is slightly different, but also kind of falls into that pattern. And it's something that Heidi and I both really love talking about. So we're happy to have you here.
Great. I'm happy to be here and get into it.
Yes. So we love to start with this question: what is your math story? And so we will start there.
Okay. I was listening to how other folks responded to this in previous shows, and you have had some fascinating responses. And I think my answer or my story is that I tried to think as little about math as possible in math classes. And like I can remember the first time I took algebra, the first of a couple times, I kind of gave up halfway through. And like my act of resistance is that every day I would line up 3 pudding cups and eat them all in the back of the class and then be done with it and just kind of like zone out. So I was not the best math student. Probably for a variety of factors. But when I became a teacher and went a few years into my teaching career, went to an amazing school to teach called Bailey's Elementary School in Fairfax, Virginia. And I was invited to join this professional development group called Math Collaborative. And it was led by an amazing math coach. Her name is Jessica Shumway. She's the author of Number Sense Routines that many people are familiar with. And it was just an amazing experience to understand how children develop understandings of number sense and of all of math, and to really become interested in children's ideas and to study that with a group of teachers and coaches and get coaching. So that really got me kind of hooked on kids thinking and the idea that I could love math, that my students could love math, and just want to be part of a professional learning community in a school that really valued teachers learning and teachers content learning and teachers pedagogy learning. I feel really lucky that I got to spend many years there.
Kassia, what grade were you teaching at that time?
So I started teaching 2nd grade there. I taught a multi-age class of 2nd and 3rd grade there. I taught kindergarten there. And then eventually I became a math coach at that school. So I kind of moved all around and got some different great experiences at that school.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I love that idea of when schools value the professional learning of their teachers and really make time and space for that. I think that's such a critical piece that is often one of the first things to go, it feels like. And I think educators, we put up with so much to begin with, but when we have that support of people that we can bounce ideas off of and that we can think with and we can struggle with and share with, that goes so far to supporting the work that we do in the classroom every day versus feeling siloed, because it can be such a lonely almost profession. Like, you're surrounded by kids all the time, you're surrounded by other people, but really having those opportunities to work professionally and be valued professionally in that space is so amazing when that happens, I think.
Yeah. And I think it never felt like the professional development was being done to me. I came in as not knowing a lot about math teaching. So that could have been the stance of like, we've got to just like cram you full of knowledge. You're behind in your math teaching. And it was just such a nice approach to like, ask us what we were noticing about our students, ask us what we were wondering, offer us amazing professional books to read and talk about together. So it always positioned us in an asset-based way. And then, of course, encouraged us to do that with our students as well. So that was the happy, not ending, middle of my math story, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like it's a hard thing for schools to do, in particular in elementary schools, because you teach all the subjects in those grades. So there's always many more things that are competing with your professional development. So how lucky you were to have had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I consider myself very lucky to have ended up there.
And so how did it get you to where you are now?
Oh, goodness. I think that it got me interested in children's thinking, but also because I got such a rich professional development, it also got me interested in teacher learning. And so even though I didn't move directly to that, I spent a long time in the classroom. Eventually, I decided that I wanted to work with teachers more and do math coaching I started at that school and then went to some other schools. And now I get to work with lots of teachers across different schools in different areas. But I often return to those like early experiences I had of professional development there and kind of how I felt and how I was positioned there. And the amazing coaching that I received from Jessica and from my other coaches, and kind of think about like, how can I do something like that? I had great mentors in that work. And along the way, I also had colleagues that were kind of more literacy focused. So my co-author of Hands Down Speak Out was a classroom teacher alongside of me down the hall. Yes, there is.
Heidi's so good. She has to see her house.
Little product placement there.
No shame in that. Like, full on bring it out. Like, let's highlight the goodness, people.
And so Christy then became a literacy coach, and we ended up at a different school together and just became really interested in talking about, we would often work in the same teachers' classrooms, but at different parts of the day, her in literacy and me in math. And we started talking about the different conversations that kids were having around math and around reading and writing, and just kind of enjoying the way that kids talk. And so that kind of got us interested in like, what are the conditions that we can set up all day long in classrooms so that kids are getting opportunities to make meaning together, whether it's make meaning of a book that they're reading together or make meaning of a math idea. And sometimes professional books or professional learning are like very content specific. This is a math book, this is a reading book, but so many elementary school teachers' lives and elementary school children's lives are not so compartmentalized, boxed off like that. So So in recent years, I've really been curious about like these things that go across the day, and talk being one of them, and how can we like build strong talk and talking communities all day long for kids.
Well, that brings us very nicely into our main question. But so thinking about how do we make talk in math class more student centered? Because I think we've all had experiences where it was adult focused
Mhm.
and in one direction.
Yep.
So what are some ways that we can start shifting our practice in making math class in particular, if we're going to stay there, but more student centered, and who is doing the talking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that last bit you said about like thinking about who's doing the talking is a nice place to begin, and think about like all of us probably had some experiences in math class or just in school in general where like you can see it in your mind's eye of like the teacher's at the front, right? And everybody else is facing there, and you don't need to like even look at anybody else because they don't really matter. What matters is performing an answer in math class. The teacher tells you whether you're right or wrong. And then you keep on. Or if you're me, you're eating pudding in the back and happy to be ignored. And so if we're defining student-centered talk, it has talk where students are getting to talk to each other more. Students are constructing more ideas together instead of just being told how to solve a problem. Students are talking about ideas that matter to them and that they feel ownership of and agency in. And just the bigger idea that we want kids who can talk in school and talk about math, yes, but really we want kids that can talk in the world about anything, right? And that can enter into productive arguments and negotiate and compromise and all those things that we really need out in the world. I hope that we can create schools and classrooms that prepare kids to do that in math, but in the world. And so that feels like, for me, the bigger purpose. And so the good news is I think that there's so many different tools and ways that we can start into this work. And some of them that I really appreciate is just getting kids having more back and forth talk between them that isn't interrupted each time by the teacher, where kids can ask each other questions, and when a kid doesn't understand something that another kid says, they ask them like, what do you mean by that? Instead of it always being the teacher's job to make the meaning for the kids.
Yeah, well, and to facilitate that, it becomes I always feel like I'm interjecting in something or like having to lead the conversation instead of it becoming, something that is more, or I guess less forced. It's that idea of are they really sharing their ideas if I have to like prompt their thinking from one point to the next. And that can be like stressful as a teacher, and like blocks, I think, the student flow of thinking too.
Yeah. I think I found that that sometimes I'm so caught up in thinking about like, these are the ideas that I anticipated would come out of this conversation. These are the mathematical goals that I have. And I'm just like pushing so hard to get to those ideas that I've neglected to notice that like only 3 kids are talking and participating in the conversation, or it's always the same kids participating, or there are so many kids that are having ideas but are not really involved in the talk or in the environment that I'm setting up for talk. And so I think one of the first things that I wanted to do when I started thinking more about this is just kind of study how kids talk to each other socially, how kids talk to each other in math, and provide more opportunities for authentic talk. And something that I've noticed is that in the past, I was more likely to like interject. If I didn't feel like the conversation was going where I was hoping for it, I would just interject with another question or a prompt, or like pushing to too much, over scaffolding probably, to where I was hoping they would go. And when I just kind of bit my tongue for a longer period of time, I found that often kids would move towards those ideas, not needing as much prompting or as much questioning as maybe I thought. But that kids sometimes were processing things and sometimes even saying the same idea a few times, and then it would get moving towards an idea. So it took longer than I was kind of expecting sometimes. But just like the simplest thing is sometimes the hardest, which is like just me talking less, the teacher talking less, and seeing what happens and trusting that students will have and interesting ideas and important ideas to share about the math.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Yep, we can.
my lighting kind of left for a moment, but it's back. Along with that, I feel like one thing that you said, I think, can ring true with like any teacher in any subject, and it's that idea where you have your goals and you see nothing else but those goals when you're in a classroom. And I think every teacher can relate to that. So what are some things that, besides biting your tongue, which is why I probably have permanent marks in my tongue, right? But what are some of the things that you have discovered to be effective so that you yourself are able to listen more to students versus listen more to your ideas that you need to get evolved in your classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, one of the things that is important to think about is different tools that I'm using for talk across a single conversation, across a week, and how kids are participating differently in those settings. So sometimes I might have let's say like a traditional conversation where I'm calling on people and I'm recording the ideas, and it looks like maybe more similar to how we might imagine math class. Sometimes I am using turn and talks. Sometimes I am using something that Christy and I call in our book a conversation club, which is when two turn and talk partners come together to make a group of 4 and have kind of a small group conversation. Sometimes I might be using a hands down conversation, which is what we call when the whole class gathers and we speak without raising hands and try to have as much of the conversation led by students with some facilitation by the teacher, but a lighter facilitation than when we're using hands. And I think about kind of collecting data in a informal way of how kids are participating, how they're listening, when they're talking a lot, when they're not talking a lot, whose ideas are being highlighted in those different settings. How can I bring different kids' ideas in? And when I think about that, nothing, that each conversation is like one little part of the unit or the math year, and that I don't have to weigh, not everything has to happen in this one conversation. In no conversation, in no classroom does like every single light bulb go off and you're like, I've met that goal for every kid. Like that's not, it's little parts growing over the course of time. And if I can view conversation more like that and vary the tools that I'm using and the kinds of conversation that they're having, I feel like I can move away a little bit from the leading questions that I might sometimes slip into asking, or the telling that I might slip into doing when I'm worried about like, I've got 5 minutes and I'm supposed to move on to something else tomorrow. I better just tell you the how to do this. Not to say that that I or anyone is doing it perfectly, but but I feel like I'm able to let kids do more of the talking, more of the thinking, more of the constructing of meaning when I'm focused on that.
So it's interesting because I think you just said a lot, but some of the things that I heard that teachers could take away with is you talked about kids talking in pairs, and then you talked about pairing up pairs. You talked about whole class, which you the hands down, right? And what was the other?
Just, I think there's also times when I do use hands and when I'm a heavier facilitator. So I think that sometimes when people think about our work with hands down conversations, they think like, well, we never use hands. And I think like hands can, when you're in a class with 20, 30 kids, hands can be a useful tool in some conversations. But just the idea that we can have like a toolkit for talk and like bring out the tools that we want that will do different things for us or help us in different ways. And that we can be constantly adding to those tools too, as we get new professional learning, read new books, if we're like centered in the idea of making talk more student centered, there's lots of different tools that we might use to achieve that goal.
So when you're working with teachers, because, you know, I was having a similar conversation with a group of teachers this week, and it was a lot about the preparation for and how you set up those systems within your classroom, because I don't know that any of this happens organically, even with adults, right? There are reasons that we have protocols for working in groups collaboratively as adults, or how we're going to listen, or that we're going to assume best intentions, or all of those things that we bring to the table.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about like why that setup is so important? And
yeah,
I'm totally leading in this, but but it's like, you know, sometimes like if you spend the time there, it pays off later on. So
yeah, like I can think of one little example with Turn and Talk. Like when I first started teaching, my teaching into Turn and Talk was like, okay, here's your partner. When I say turn and talk, you're going to turn and talk. Okay. And then that was it for like the rest of the year. Right. That was all the teaching into it I did. But, and so sometimes that meant that sometimes kids had robust talk in that, or sometimes they turned and stared at each other, or sometimes they each said like a totally independent thought and then sat there until I said, turn back to me. So if I thought about like, what kinds of things am I hoping that students might do in that turn and talk? What do kids already do when they're talking socially to each other at lunch or on the playground? Because I think we always have to be constantly teaching into talking and listening, and kids always come with as talkers and listeners from their own homes, from their own communities, and we want to, from previous years of school, and we want to build on that and build on those strengths too. So as I moved away from my one not that great turn and talk lesson, I thought about like teaching turn and talk lessons on things like how do you like to be listened to? How do we know we're being listened to? Ask your partner, how would they like to be listened to? And we make a chart of ways to listen. And some of that looks like kind of traditional school listening of knee to knee, eye to eye. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it means like saying little words like, yeah, like things that we do to show each other that we're listening. And then asking after the conversation, like, was your partner listening to you? How did you know? How did that make you feel? Like, so that is even like before, like, how do we do things like adding on to each other's idea, or how do we do things like agreeing or disagreeing with a partner? Just really leaning into like some of the listening moves around talking with a partner. And then of course that pays off in other settings too, in the whole group and other small group work times that you might use. But I always think that sometimes those things, we think like, oh, this class isn't very good at that, or these kids are too young for this. And it's really like, well, we've been teaching a lot of math, but we haven't been much teaching or exploring, like, how do we talk and listen together as a class explicitly? And I think sometimes we worry that we don't have time for that. But the good news about that is that those are things that we want them to be doing all day long. So if we think about this in reading, then later in math class, we can say, remember when you were thinking about how your partner likes to be listened to? Again, we can think about that here. So it feels like something that's like really worth investing in to me.
I mean, those are life skills.
Right.
I mean, I mean, you hope your kids go out into the world and are able to communicate with other people and to state a point that's poignant, and to have the vocabulary to be able to speak their mind and to build a relationship, and all of those things are what you're teaching. So it's not, I mean, I know that teachers do feel like they don't have time, but that's that's not just a school skill. It happens to work really nice in school because it's going to work really nice in life.
Right. And when we think about like meetings we've been in where we're like, oh, that person's going to say like their own idea, whether it was connected or not, or that person like dominates and never lets any other voices in. Like, I always think about like, what could that person, like, what little talk lesson does that person need here? So like as adults, we're still like really learning to be talkers and listeners too. And we're different talkers and listeners in different settings. Which sometimes we tend to say like, oh, that kid is quiet, instead of thinking about like, what's happening in this particular setting. How are they a talker and a listener across different settings, which we can kind of imagine as ourselves as adults, places where we're quieter or louder or more comfortable or not very comfortable at all. And I think the same is true for kids, and we can kind of study that and think about them. And that's a more useful way of thinking about that than just like that kid is quiet or that kid dominates. To think about how they're different in different settings.
Love it.
When I know you mentioned this, the difficulty, I guess, of when we are setting up or kind of building where we think the conversation might go and what strategies some students might share. Like, I think we usually feel like those are good practices to have as teachers and adults. And so that's why when it's not going our way, then why we might feel like, no, come back here. Let's go. But like, do you have any instances, and if you don't, it's totally okay, because it's kind of on the spot question, like examples of when that situation you thought was going off the rails, but in the end, like either went somewhere unexpected for you that turned out better than what you thought, or that completely didn't, and just
I think I definitely continue to have both those instances. I think one where I thought like, this is not going to work out, we're going to have to go back to a different question, was we asked some second graders, is 1/2 big or small? And we kind of chose that big open question. They were in their fraction unit. We chose a fraction that they had some intuitive understandings of, even at the beginning of this fraction unit. And for longer than I was hoping, this little group, as a group of 4, was just saying, it's big, it's small, it's big and small, without really getting into like reasoning why. And I thought like, maybe there needed to be a visual, maybe there needed to be a context, like, okay, I have options, but I'm just going to like wait a little bit. And then someone said like, well, what about 1/2 of a cake? And another kid said like, is it a big cake or a small cake? It depends. And then I was like, yes, that is like the big idea that I had planned about, was like that the whole matters when we're thinking about fractions. And then someone else said something later, like in like great kid language, was he said, what you don't understand is that if you cut it in more pieces, the pieces get smaller. And the denominator gets bigger. So like all those ideas that are like important in that grade, important for long after, started to come out. And it could have not. But just giving it, that was like an example of and it wasn't that long, but like when you're in the moment of it, you're thinking like, okay, I've got to get ready with my next question because this is not going where I think. And I just gave it like a little bit longer, and they started to get to something really interesting without my prompting. I think there are times when conversations do kind of go off the rails, whether it's a turn and talk or a whole class conversation, and that's just kind of being human, I think, and that kids don't always like have the list of like the ideas I've anticipated to dig into.
You should just give them that. It's
right.
so much easier.
Listen, I really wanted you to bring this up. Could someone?
I know. This is where we're going. Hello.
So sometimes I do have like those like back pocket questions where it might just be a different way of looking at the problem, and I try not to over scaffold it or to give it all away. But sometimes a follow-up question is helpful, or sometimes kids are kind of dancing around an idea, and it's helpful if I use my teacher voice, my facilitating voice, to say like, it seems like some of you are saying, but others of you are saying, let's talk more about that, and kind of like focuses it where maybe it was like pinging all around to a bunch of different ideas. And I want to focus it more towards a particular math goal. And that's okay. So I think like, it's not that, I think student-centered doesn't mean that I don't have goals that I'm working towards in math, or that I don't facilitate. It's that we're working to focus it more in the students' words and in the students' ideas. But of course, the teacher is playing a very important role in the classroom and in the conversation as well.
Yeah. Love it. This is my favorite thing about teaching math. I strive to do this every day with teachers, for sure.
Yeah. The good thing about it is that it is like a lifelong practice, right? Like learning to facilitate, talk, to listen well to students. And there are conversations that I walk away and I think like, I was not a very good listener in that conversation to kids, with adults, or I wish I had said this or that. But like the practice of it, like the practice of anything else, like you continue to grow and build muscle for it, always being imperfect, like everything in teaching. It's always humbling to teach.
True enough. True enough.
Absolutely. So we love reading about your work and knowing about it, but what are some other ways that people can learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, Christy and I have a not very frequently updated blog and website, but it does have some good posts and some videos and some other resources that we've put there around our book, Hands Down, Speak Out. And there's the blog, the website, and then despite Twitter turning into a weird place and still there. And there's my handle. And then I'm also like testing the waters of Instagram and seeing what's out there on that same handle, and like not really knowing what I'm doing there.
We completely understand that.
Yes,
we
do.
I have not gone to TikTok or any of those other places in terms of putting content out.
Yeah.
No pressure. No pressure.
No pressure at all. We can be where we're at, and it's still great. And we will also say you can pick up both books through Stenhouse. They deliver for free as well, as the big box or online versions.
That's right. You can always get the best price there. And I'm not just saying that because I work there.
No, we understand, because that's how these ones came to me as well. So I'm saying that, and it's more often than not that the big scary store is coming to my house for books, but
Right.
but in this case,
I
we'll
understand.
go there. So we so appreciate you coming
Yes.
on and sharing your time with us, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you
having
so
me, and
much.
thanks for hosting such interesting guests on your show and
Oh,
talking about great math stuff.
yeah, we're blessed. We're really blessed.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kassia.
So
That was great.
yes, no, I know. I love that idea, and just the constant practice of that, I think is something to keep working at. We are off for a week or so, 2 weeks, I think it is. But on March 8th, we will be speaking with Jennifer Bay Williams. And we're really thankful that so many great writers and math educators come on and share their time with you and with us. And so we just really appreciate that.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us tonight. And until we see you on March 8th, we hope that you can keep math creative, curious, and inclusive for all. Thanks so much. Have a good night,
everyone.